Your immune system is built to hunt invaders, but every so often that immune system turns its weaponry on you. It picks on your own tissues. This could be your thyroid, your joints, the lining around your nerves, and then it goes after it. This phenomenon is known as autoimmune disease. And over the last 50 years, it's gone from being an uncommon condition to a surprisingly normal threat to our health. Welcome to sammillerscience, where you're joining me nearly 2 decades into my personal journey to bridge the gap between macros, metabolism, muscle, and medicine. If you're joining me, thanks for trusting me to elevate your health and realize your true potential. Each week and inside every episode, I'll be sharing methods and models from my coaching journey and my personal experience, as well as the science that you need to achieve whatever specific goals you're working on in your life. Let's jump in to today's show. As the numbers have climbed, you almost certainly know someone in your life who has some type of autoimmune disease. The curve is still climbing, and there are many nutritional, environmental, and lifestyle reasons why. Picture someone, let's call her Jane. She's in her 40s, who eats well, she trains, tracks everything, and she feels like her body is working against her, and just friction when it comes to her health. Jane learns that she has Hashimoto's, an autoimmune condition aimed specifically at her thyroid. What almost nobody tells Jane is that the two things that move symptoms like hers more than anything are going to be stress and her diet, which puts far more of this in her hands than a 10-minute doctor's appointment would ever let on. We'll talk about this more inside today's episode. So whether you coach people for a living or you're just trying to better understand your own body, this episode on autoimmunity is for you. We'll talk about what happens when the body turns on itself and what shifts once someone is living with it. There are around 100 autoimmune conditions, and they don't all behave the same way. So no single answer fits every single one. Jane's Hashimoto's sits a little more on the mild end of the spectrum, whereas something like MS, lupus, or rheumatoid arthritis can potentially be even more debilitating. This episode is meant to serve as the umbrella view for autoimmunity and really discover how the whole category works. In a case like Hashimoto's, it's the thyroid taking the hits, which is why it feels like there's so much friction in daily living, and especially when it comes to our metabolic health. In rheumatoid arthritis, it's the joints. In MS, it's the coating around the nerves. And in lupus, it can be half a dozen organs at once, the same underlying mistake landing on a different target. How an immune system ends up attacking its body is meant to defend is a story about training. So early on, immune cells, like T cells, go through kind of a screening in the thymus, which is an organ behind your breastbone. What's interesting is that the body deliberately produces cells that are capable of attacking its own tissue and then kills off almost all of them during that screening process. The few that survive have very specific jobs to do. Holding those survivors in line is a secondary crew called regulatory T cells. Picture the whole thing as a balance. It's an ecosystem between the cells that can attack your own tissue and the regulators that keep them honest. Autoimmunity is what happens when that balance tips out of favor. So there's more attackers and fewer regulators to rein them in. And everything that follows from that and every factor that raises someone's risk is just something that leans on that balance in terms of autoimmunity, tipping the scales in the wrong way. For the person living within this scenario, none of this shows up as some sort of tidy diagnosis. It's usually the combination of really troublesome symptoms, things like fatigue, brain fog, and the sense that your body is working against you even when you feel like you're trying to take strides to improve your body and your health. And this can vary depending on the autoimmune condition. But there's rarely ever a single cause. It's typically a stack of factors. And this is why hunting for the one thing to blame in autoimmunity is usually a losing game. Statistically speaking, around 80% of people with autoimmune disease are women, partly because so many autoimmune-linked gene variants sit on the X chromosome and women carry 2 X chromosomes. A family history then raises odds again. So let's say a woman like Jane in our example has both. So she has an aunt who has lupus, and genetics, just being female, set her in terms of having more predisposing risk factors than other individuals. And then lifestyle factors trigger the cascade or domino effect that leads to autoimmunity. Hormones pull in both directions, and this is one of the more counterintuitive parts of autoimmunity is the hormonal involvement. Broadly, high estrogen and low progesterone in women, along with low testosterone, nudges the immune system towards attacking because estrogen ramps up immune cell production while progesterone and testosterone help calm it. This pattern is common in women around Jane's age, but the reverse is also true in that adequate estrogen protects against rheumatoid arthritis and lupus specifically, which is why those two often flare after menopause and quiet down during pregnancy when hormones run in more of a supraphysiological range. So there's no singular hormone rule with autoimmunity. It really depends entirely on the condition. Hormonal birth control belongs in this conversation too because of its impact on ovulation and the entire endocrine system. So it can be linked to higher risk for MS, IBD, lupus, and some skin conditions, though not necessarily Hashimoto's. So aside from naming some of the conditions and various risk factors, we want to think about lifestyle. So things that have come into play across someone's health history. And a big one here is the gut microbiome. So this can be shaped from early years, whether someone was a C-section baby, if they were breastfed, how many courses of antibiotics they had as a child or early adult, and the foods that they eat today. Vitamin D and zinc status also play a role here since they basically help the immune system to tell itself, kind of distinguishing between itself and invaders. Blood sugar also plays a role because if you have hyperglycemia, that can contribute to inflammation. A circadian rhythm that's wrecked by poor sleep or shift work can contribute to autoimmunity. And then a big one that most people are aware of is stress, both chronic stress and unresolved trauma. Each one of these factors tips the balance towards autoimmunity. So by the time a diagnosis shows up, like in Jane's case, if she's experiencing this in her 40s, most of what drove it was lifestyle, although there were some hereditary factors. Different types of stress and body burden can elevate risk. So when you have that compounding blood sugar instability, gut inflammation from a poor diet, circadian dysregulation, and psychological stress all feed into the same fire. Even if not every single person has all factors, they may have some of them. One of the most overlooked aspects of this is trauma and PTSD. A lot of people with autoimmunity are carrying old trauma that sits as a physiological residue, undermining their internal health. And there's a few mechanisms behind it, but there's one big one. So one marker of prior adverse events and PTSD is chronically low cortisol. While a lot of people view cortisol as bad, it's important to remember that cortisol is actually anti-inflammatory and helps hold the immune system in check. But when it runs too low, the immune system can run hot. So health history before the autoimmune diagnosis matters, as well as chronic stress and past adverse events, whether in early adulthood or childhood. If someone is living with an autoimmune diagnosis, here's what works, and it comes down to a few big rocks that we're going to use the entire way. So sleep, stress, and diet. We'll start with sleep and stress because they both impact your HPA axis, and that's where we can get some really fast wins. And then we'll talk about some practices that aren't really super exotic, but things that can help on a daily basis. So that could be meditation, breath work, time outside, journaling, really whatever a person will stick with to reduce chronically high stress levels. And just as important in that is whether someone feels supported at home, if they're in healthy relationships, since toxic relationships can consistently drain individuals with autoimmune disease and contribute to it in the first place. And a lot of this seems like soft and fluffy stuff, but it's something to be taken super seriously for someone with an autoimmune condition when they have less physiological resilience. There is a specific supplement trap that I wanted to mention in this section of the show that people fall into on the stress management side, and it gets overlooked in a lot of cases of autoimmune disease, and that is when people are going high dose with ashwagandha. It's one of the go-to stress supplements for half of the fitness industry, but it's a nightshade. So if someone reacts to nightshades in their diet and identified them as a dietary trigger and they have an autoimmune disease, then the ashwagandha has to go as well because that is a source of nightshades. That's an easy point of overlap to miss because people sort of think of food in one department and supplements in another, but adding an herbal adaptogen can cause similar issues, just like if you were getting nightshades like eggplant or peppers from food. Sleep is also going to be important because your immune system runs on a circadian clock, and shift work and chronic jet lag measurably raise the rates for MS, rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, and Hashimoto's. So having a consistent sleep-wake cycle, even on the weekends, getting morning sunlight in your eyes, and no hard training and caffeine right before bed are all incredibly important. It's the same advice you've heard across the health industry, but instead of viewing it as optional for people with autoimmunity, we have to think of it as essential. When it comes to diet and nutrition, the way I want you to think about this aspect of autoimmune disease management is it's a ladder that you climb based on severity of symptoms, lab markers, and disease progression. The bottom rung of the nutritional ladder, which doesn't mean it's not important, it's actually very important and wide-reaching, is going to be managing blood sugar. A body riding glucose highs and crashes all day long can damage the endothelial lining and contribute to systemic inflammation. So the goal is to flatten the blood sugar swings or make them less dramatic. A cheap glucometer from any grocery store tested an hour or 2 hours after meals shows exactly what a given meal means for you in your life, and then that feedback changes behavior faster than any rule you could hand someone. The next thing to consider would be fasting. So blood sugar management is first, and eating more of like a Mediterranean style balanced diet. But fasting can be helpful because for autoimmune disease, the fast really calms symptoms down very quickly. But the problem is when people stop fasting and normal eating resumes, the symptoms come back. But fasting drives immune autophagy. So you could think of this as the body clearing out a chunk of those self-attacking cells and resetting the immune system towards tolerance. But when people go back to their old way of eating, the immune system slowly starts to drift back, especially if you don't have the other lifestyle factors in place. So fasting in isolation typically doesn't fix anything by itself beyond the acute symptom relief. So it feels good, but it's not necessarily a promise of long-term remission. Fasting just buys us a calmer window of symptoms to start to change the diet and manage the stress and get the sleep routine that works. And that's what's going to contribute to symptom relief long-term and autoimmune disease remission. For a more debilitating case, with the right preparation, a 3-day fast can deliver fast relief, but should be taken very seriously since most people have never done a 2 to 3 day fast before. Some of the most challenging work for serious conditions like MS, RA, and lupus is usually an elimination diet when we've noticed that the removal of certain dietary irritants is leading to improvements in symptoms. And it doesn't just need to be gut symptoms. It could be improving fatigue symptoms or hair loss or improving recovery. You could have no gut symptoms at all and still benefit from one of these elimination approaches if you have an autoimmune condition, which I think is a common source of confusion. Two of the most popular and established protocols for autoimmune conditions are AIP, which is autoimmune paleo, and Wahls. So AIP pulls out gluten, dairy, processed foods, sugar, soy, eggs, legumes, nuts, seeds, and nightshades, and most grains. Wahls, on the other hand, is still an elimination-based approach, but it keeps the nightshades and the nuts and instead pushes a heavy daily target of sulfur-rich vegetables, leafy greens, and colorful produce. And you're basically trying to achieve the same goal. You're just taking a different route in terms of diet to get there. There's two things to know before starting either one of these elimination approaches. They don't work for everyone, and some people do reach full remission and others maybe get 50 to 70% better. So it's really more of a trial and error than an absolute promise of improvement. Remember that the first week or two can actually feel worse instead of better because as overgrown bacteria die off, they release a compound called LPS into the blood. That die-off usually passes within about 2 weeks. So if die-off symptoms persist beyond 2 weeks, definitely talk to a health professional. After following one of these approaches, reintroduction becomes a skill in and of itself. Common advice is to continue the diet until the symptoms settle and then stay settled, which for serious conditions may take several months, and then bring foods back in the order that they were eliminated. Some people keep a few foods out for life, and before you jump through your phone screen or start shaking your laptop, remember that for a lot of people, when the alternative is feeling terrible every day, even though obviously we'd love to have a more balanced or wide-ranging diet, a lot of people will make this trade-off without much fuss because they want to keep their severe symptoms at bay. For very serious autoimmune conditions, the top rung of the elimination ladder is keto. I know it sounds crazy, but keto gets honorable mention specifically for MS. A ketogenic diet that goes easy on dairy, sometimes off of dairy entirely, reshapes the immune system through the gut and through the actual ketones themselves. So people love to claim that keto destroys microbial diversity, and the research often shows the opposite, that it can actually rebuild a damaged microbiome. They do this through the ketones. So the ketones lower oxidative stress. It calms inflammation by hitting something called the NLRP3 inflammasome and protecting cells, including neurons. And that last part is exactly why MS responds to this diet, because the MS brain often can't burn glucose very well, or at least efficiently, and ketones hand those cells a fuel that they can use more readily. If someone's carrying extra body fat with metabolic problems and insulin resistance on top of autoimmunity, or they have significant neurological symptoms like numbness, tingling, nerve pain, brain fog. Keto is a rung on the ladder to try. Remember, it's not the only option, but it is an option. And nobody should be living on bacon here on this type of keto diet. And the carb budget should go towards greens and vegetables, or maybe a small amount of berries, depending on the person's size and activity level, if they can stay in ketosis while eating that. When these cases are more severe, sometimes they need longer fasts. Sometimes there's physician-designed elemental diets. Some people will do a stretch of carnivore before slowly rebuilding and incorporating more foods. And almost all of them can widen the diet once symptoms settle down and you get out of a flare. That's always the aim, is to have broader nutritional intake. So some people never deal with the extreme end of the spectrum, but it's helpful to know that it's there as an option for the most severe cases. Now, ideally, instead of being reactive, we want to be proactive and get ahead of it, because this little bit of prevention can be even more valuable than trying to face these symptoms head on once they've been really, really bad for a long period of time. So let's say Jane's sister is trying to prevent an autoimmune condition, keeping vitamin D and zinc in place, making sure to get great sleep, addressing hormonal balance through lifestyle and nutrition. That is going to be a game changer for anyone who may have a predisposition to autoimmunity, along with managing stress and having some practices in place to make sure that we can manage stress when it pops up in our life. So even someone like Jane, the story we shared earlier, and her sister, we remember that genetic and hereditary baselines are fixed, but nutrition, environment, and lifestyle drive the expression of those genes. So for many clients, implementing serious lifestyle strategies may land them in the 70 to 80% improvement mark. And for some people, getting lifestyle, stress management, and nutrition in place may prevent the autoimmune disease or the predisposing factors in terms of hereditary profile from rearing its head entirely. Inside today's episode, we stayed at a 10,000 foot view of autoimmune disease on purpose. I have other content on thyroid and Hashimoto's, but for now, the thing to walk away with is understanding that the body turning on itself is a progression largely driven by chronic stress, lifestyle, gut health, hormonal dysfunction, and nutrient status. So there's a balance to this, and a lot of what tips that balance towards autoimmunity are the decisions that we're making every single day inside our lifestyle. I hope this episode was helpful for you. If you learned something new, please share the show with someone else who may benefit, or drop a 5-star rating and review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to the show. If you're on YouTube, give it a thumbs up and make sure you're subscribed so you never miss a future video, and hit that notification bell so you get notified of new content when it lands on the channel. If you're a health and fitness professional and you want to learn more about the deeper physiology and science of things like autoimmune disease, hormones, the gut microbiome, and more, you'll definitely want to check out our functional nutrition and metabolism specialization program. You can learn more in the show notes. Begin to apply this science with your clients to help them optimize their health and sort of ward off some of these things that happen as a result of a modern lifestyle. I appreciate you guys tuning in to today's show, and I will talk to you in the next episode.